Right now, in late 2025, Larry Hoover stays locked up in an Illinois state prison. He's serving the rest of his original 150 to 200-year murder sentence. For almost 30 years, he lived in extreme isolation at Colorado's DX Florence Supermax prison. He spent 23 hours every day in a concrete cell the size of a parking space. There were no windows and almost no human contact. His name is Larry Hoover. Some people think he's a monster, a crime boss who caused terrible violence and destruction. Other people think he's a political prisoner, a community leader who tried to help his people escape poverty. The organization he built, the Gangster Disciples, became one of the most powerful street organizations in American history. It had tens of thousands of members and an economic empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's what makes this story so scary. Larry Hoover has been in prison since 1973. He was 23 years old when the cell door first closed. He'll probably die there, and yet for decades. Even from behind those walls, his influence shaped the streets of Chicago and cities across the nation. How does a boy from Mississippi become King Larry? How does someone build an empire from a prison cell? And what does his story tell us about America itself? About poverty, power, race, and the thin line between community leadership and criminal enterprise. But how did a boy from Mississippi become one of the most influential figures in Chicago's history? Before we dive into this incredible true story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you winding down for the night? Or maybe you're on a long drive. Drop a comment below. And if you're ready for the full story of Larry Hoover, the rise, the fall, and the legacy that still echoes today, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Give this video a like so more people can discover this untold history. Now let's go back to where it all began. The year is 1950. The place is Jackson, Mississippi, on November 30th. A child is born who will one day be called king, but there are no crowns in Jackson, Mississippi in 1950, not for black families. There's only Jim Crow segregation and the crushing weight of a system designed to keep people in their place. Larry Hoover enters a world of strict racial boundaries. In Jackson, black families live on one side of town. White families live on the other. Black children go to underfunded schools with hand-me-down books. Black workers take the jobs nobody else wants for pay nobody else would accept. It's the Deep South in the time of lynchings and separate water fountains, where looking a white person in the eye at the wrong moment could cost you your life. But something is stirring in Black America. Something that will change Larry Hoover's life before he can even remember Mississippi. The Great Migration, between 1916 and 1970. About 6 million African Americans left the South. They packed their bags, gathered their children, and headed north to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia. They were chasing a promise, a dream of something better. They'd heard the stories in the North. You could get factory jobs that paid real money. Your kids could go to better schools. You didn't have to step off the sidewalk when a white person walked by. The South was killing them. Slowly and sometimes quickly, so they left. The Hoover family made that journey when Larry was just 4 years old. They joined the river of black families flowing northward. Their destination was Chicago. Illinois, the Windy City, the second city. The city of broad shoulders and big dreams. But Chicago in 1954 wasn't the promised land they'd hoped for the Hoover family. The journey north began on a Greyhound bus packed shoulder to shoulder with other hopeful migrants. Suitcases were tied with rope. Children clutched paper bags of fried chicken and cornbread for the long ride. Larry, barely 4, pressed his face against the window as the cotton fields of Mississippi gave way to flat Indiana farmland. Then finally the smoky skyline of Chicago rising like a distant mirage. They arrived at the Illinois Central Station, exhausted but buzzing with possibility. Relatives who had come earlier met them with hugs and warnings. It's better up here. But it ain't heaven. The family squeezed into a cramped apartment on 63rd Street. Sharing one bathroom with another family, Larry's father found work at a stockyard. Slaughtering animals from dawn until his hands bled, his mother took in laundry. Scrubbing stains under dim light long after the children slept. Young Larry explored the streets wide-eyed. Snow fell for the first time, thick and magical, covering the cracked sidewalks, but he also learned quickly where he could and couldn't go. The corner store was owned by a white man who watched black kids like hawks. The playground had older white teens who sometimes chased black children away with sticks and slurs. There were invisible lines drawn through the city that everyone understood, but no one spoke about. In those early years, Larry was quiet and observant. He watched how his parents carried the weight of the South in their shoulders, heads slightly bowed even when no white person was around. He listened to late-night kitchen conversations about lynchings back home, about cousins who disappeared, about the uncle who was beaten for registering to vote. Those stories planted seeds. The world was not fair. And fairness would not be given. It would have to be taken. Yet there were moments of joy, too. Summer block parties where neighbors grilled ribs and played blues records loud enough to drown out sirens. Church on Sunday, the choir lifting voices so high it felt like they could reach God himself and demand answers. Larry sang in that choir as a boy, his voice clear and strong, earning smiles from old women who pinched his cheeks and called him creature. Those memories, bittersweet, tender, and raw, traveled with him as Englewood changed around him. The Hoover family settled in Englewood, a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. In the 1950s, Englewood was changing. What had been a mostly white working-class neighborhood was rapidly becoming a black neighborhood, as white families fled to the suburbs in what would later be called white flight. This demographic shift happened everywhere black migrants settled in Chicago. The city's white residents didn't want to live next to black families, real estate agents engaged in blockbusting. They'd scare white homeowners into selling cheap by warning that black families were moving in and property values would crash. Then they'd sell those same homes to black families at inflated prices. The Chicago that welcomed Larry Hoover was a city of invisible but very real boundaries. Chicago wasn't segregated by law like Jackson, Mississippi. It didn't need to be. It was segregated by practice, by policy, by violence. Black families could only get housing in certain neighborhoods. Banks wouldn't give them mortgages in white areas, a practice called redlining. If a black family did manage to move into a white neighborhood, they might face violence, rocks through windows, firebombs, angry mobs. So black Chicago was compressed into the South Side and West Side. Neighborhoods like Englewood, Woodlawn, North Lawndale, and the notorious Robert Taylor Homes public housing projects, these areas became overcrowded. The schools became overwhelmed, the infrastructure decayed. And into this environment, young Larry Hoover grew up. By the time Larry was old enough to understand the world around him, the late 1950s and early 1960s, Englewood was struggling. The good factory jobs that had drawn black families north were starting to disappear. Automation and deindustrialization were beginning their long destruction of Chicago's manufacturing base. The jobs that remained often went to white workers first. Black unemployment climbed, poverty spread. Families crumbled under economic pressure. And in that vacuum, something else grew: gangs. The first gangs Larry encountered weren't the drug empires of later legend. They were neighborhood clubs, guys with slicked back hair, sharp creases in their pants, leather jackets with names stitched on the back. They called themselves the Egyptians, the Capris, the Continentals. They fought with fists and chains over who could claim a certain corner, a certain girl, a certain slice of respect. But by the early 1960s, the tone was shifting. Guns started appearing cheap. .22s passed down from older brothers. sawed-off shotguns hidden under car seats. The fights weren't just about pride anymore. They were about survival in a city that seemed to be abandoning entire neighborhoods. Larry, now in his early teens, stood out even then, tall, lean, with calm eyes that seemed to see 3 moves ahead. Teachers noticed it. He was bright, quick with numbers, persuasive when he spoke in class debates. One counselor pulled him aside after he organized a successful student protest against broken heaters in the school. "Boy, you could be somebody important one day." Larry smiled politely but said nothing. He already knew the system didn't reward black boys from Englewood for being somebody important unless that somebody served the system's interests. On the streets, respect came faster. When a bully from a rival clique tried to tax younger kids for walking through a park, 14-year-old Larry stepped in. No shouting, no wild swinging. Just precise words and a stare that made the older boy back down. Word spread. That young Hoover boy don't play. He started hanging with a small crew that would eventually feed into the Supreme Gangsters. They weren't deep into crime yet, mostly petty theft, dice games, protecting their block from outsiders. But Larry was already thinking bigger. He read books he borrowed from the library. Biographies of Napoleon, Malcolm X's autobiography, even Machiavelli's The Prince, late at night. He'd lie awake listening to gunshots echo in the distance and wonder how order could be built from chaos. He saw how fragile most crews were. One hothead could start a war that wiped out half the members. He saw leaders get high on their own power and make stupid mistakes, quietly. He began writing ideas in a spiral notebook: ranks, rules, ways to settle beefs without bloodshed that cost territory. He didn't share it widely yet, but a few close friends noticed he always seemed to know what move came next. When David Barksdale's Devil's Disciples began absorbing smaller groups, Larry watched closely. He admired King David's charisma, but noted the weaknesses. Too much depended on one man's health and reputation. Larry started dreaming of something more durable. Now, it's important to understand that Chicago's gang history is long and complex. Gangs in Chicago didn't start with black youth in the 1960s. The city had gang problems going back to the 1800s. Irish gangs, Italian gangs, Polish gangs. White ethnic gangs once terrorized their own neighborhoods and fought over territory. But by the 1960s, something new was happening on the South Side. Black youth squeezed into overcrowded neighborhoods with failing schools, and few legitimate opportunities began forming their own organizations. At first, many of these groups weren't even criminal. They were social clubs, protection societies, groups of young men banding together in a hostile world. The Blackstone Rangers, the Vice Lords, the Devil's Disciples, the Devil's Disciples. That's the important one for our story. The Devil's Disciples were formed in 1966 in Englewood, on the same streets where young Larry Hoover was coming of age. The founder was a young man named David Barksdale, who would later be known as King David. David Barksdale was charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious. He wasn't content with just having a neighborhood crew. He had a vision of something bigger, something organized, something powerful. Under his leadership, the Devil's Disciples began to grow, absorbing smaller groups, expanding territory, building structure. And somewhere on those Englewood streets, teenage Larry Hoover was watching, learning, and beginning his own journey into this world. Larry Hoover was a teenager in the mid-1960s, right at the moment when Chicago was exploding with social tension. The civil rights movement was reaching its peak. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago in 1966 to fight housing discrimination and face some of the worst violence of his career. White mobs threw rocks and bottles, screaming racial slurs, "Doctor." King later said he had never faced hatred like what he encountered in Chicago. In 1968, King was assassinated in Memphis. Chicago erupted in riots. The West Side burned. Mayor Richard Daley ordered police to shoot arsonists on sight. 9 people died. Hundreds were injured. Entire blocks were destroyed and would never be rebuilt. For black youth in Chicago, the message was clear. The system doesn't care about you. Nobody's coming to save you. You're on your own. In that environment, gangs offered something the legitimate world didn't: belonging, protection, purpose, and money. Larry Hoover, by all accounts, was intelligent. He was a natural leader. He had the kind of charisma that made people listen, made them follow. In another time, another place, with different opportunities, he might have been a CEO, a politician, a community organizer working within the system. But this was Englewood in the 1960s, and the most powerful organization in his neighborhood wasn't the school board or the local business association. It was the Devil's Disciples. By his mid-teens, Larry Hoover was involved, not peripherally, not casually. He was in deep. The gang structure in Chicago at this time was becoming increasingly sophisticated. These weren't just loose collections of friends hanging on corners. They were developing hierarchies, rules, territories. They were forming alliances and waging wars. The Devil's Disciples were in constant conflict with rival gangs, particularly the Black P-Stones, who controlled territory just south of them. These weren't fistfights. By the late 1960s, guns were common, young men were dying, but they were also building something. The Devil's Disciples had structure. They had ranks, leaders, enforcers, foot soldiers. They had rules about loyalty, about how to handle disputes, about what happened to traitors. They collected money from drug sales, robberies, and extortion, and they pooled resources. David Barksdale ran the organization with an iron fist, but he was smart enough to recognize talent. And in Larry Hoover, he saw someone special. Larry was still a teenager, but he was already showing the qualities that would later make him King Larry. He was disciplined. He was strategic. He didn't lose his temper or make impulsive decisions. He thought ahead. He was also willing to do what was necessary. In gang life, that's a crucial quality. Violence isn't optional. It's the currency of respect. Larry Hoover understood that early, but something else was happening in Larry Hoover's mind during these formative years. He was observing not just how gangs worked, but why they failed. He saw crews fall apart because of internal disputes. He saw leaders lose power because they were erratic or stupid. He saw organizations crumble because they had no discipline, no real structure beyond the personality of one charismatic leader. Larry Hoover began to envision something different, something bigger, something that could outlast any one person. That vision crystallized during the 1968 riots. As the West Side burned after King's assassination, Larry, 17 now, watched from Englewood rooftops. Looters hit stores, police shot indiscriminately. National Guard rolled in, but gangs paused wars. Some even patrolled to prevent arson on their blocks. Larry saw raw power. Organized young men could control chaos when the system couldn't. He started sketching ideas on notebook paper: ranks, territories, rules. He shared them with supreme gangster lieutenants. We fight each other for scraps while stones take whole pies. Imagine if we combined forces. Most laughed. Gangs don't merge, but a few listened. Meanwhile, David Barksdale faced similar thoughts. Shot in 1969, he survived but was weakened. He realized endless war benefited no one. Through mutual contacts, a shared lawyer, a neutral pastor, feelers went out. First meeting, summer 1969. A South Side park at dusk. Barksdale, bandaged from his wounds, and Hoover, cool and composed. Talked for hours. No guns, no crews, just two young kings seeing the future. They agreed on principles: unity over war, structure over chaos, growth over destruction. The merger began slowly. Joint parties, shared drug spots, coordinated protection. By 1970, it was official. The Black Gangster Disciple Nation was born, and Larry Hoover, still a teen, was its architect in waiting. He didn't know it yet, but he was preparing to build an empire. The late 1960s in Chicago were a pressure cooker of violence, poverty, political upheaval, and social change. The Democratic National Convention came to Chicago in 1968, and police rioted against protesters in what would later be called a police riot. The whole world was watching, and what they saw was chaos on the South Side. Away from the convention and the cameras, young black men were forming organizations that would outlast the protest movements, outlast the hippies and the radicals, outlast the moment. They were building institutions. Criminal institutions, yes, violent institutions, absolutely. But institutions nonetheless. Structures that would persist for generations. That would grow to have more influence in certain neighborhoods than the government itself. And Larry Hoover was about to help create the most powerful one of all. The year 1969 changed everything. By this time, Larry Hoover was 19 years old. He'd been active in the Devil's Disciples for years, and he'd risen through the ranks. He was trusted by David Barksdale. He was feared by rivals. He was respected by his peers. But the Devil's Disciples, as powerful as they'd become, faced a problem. On the south side of Chicago, they weren't the only game in town. There were multiple black gangs competing for territory, for money, for respect. The Blackstone Rangers controlled large swaths of the South Side. Other smaller gangs held pockets of territory. And to the north and west of Devil's Disciples territory, there was another organization, the Supreme Gangsters. The Supreme Gangsters were a separate organization also on the South Side. They were smaller than the Devil's Disciples, but growing. They controlled some valuable territory and had their own leadership structure in the violent world of Chicago gangs. The Supreme Gangsters and Devil's Disciples could have gone to war. That would have been the expected move. Fight for dominance, eliminate the competition. But David Barksdale had a different idea, and Larry Hoover, his protege, helped make it happen. What if instead of fighting, they merged? The concept was revolutionary. Chicago gangs didn't merge. They conquered or were conquered. They fought until one side won. The idea of two powerful organizations voluntarily combining forces was almost unheard of. But Barksdale and Hoover saw the bigger picture. A merger would create the largest, most powerful black gang in Chicago history. It would give them control over a vast territory. It would eliminate a rival without firing a shot. And it would send a message to every other gang in the city. The rules had changed. In 1969, the merger happened. The Devil's Disciples and the Supreme Gangsters became the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Later, it would be shortened to simply the Gangster Disciples. Or GD. David Barksdale became the overall leader. The king, Larry Hoover, became the second in command, his most trusted lieutenant. Together, they began building something unprecedented in Chicago's gang history. The newly formed Gangster Disciples controlled a huge swath of the South Side. They had thousands of members. They had territory stretching across multiple neighborhoods. And they had two brilliant, ambitious leaders who understood that to truly dominate, they needed more than just muscle. They needed organization. David Barksdale and Larry Hoover set about creating a structure unlike anything Chicago gangs had seen. This wasn't going to be a loose collection of street crews. This was going to be a corporation. They established a board of directors, yes, a criminal organization with a board of directors. The board consisted of the top leaders from different regions. These men met regularly to discuss strategy, resolve disputes, and make major decisions. No single leader could make unilateral decisions on important matters. There was a democratic process, at least among the elite, below the board. There was a strict hierarchy. Governors controlled large regions. Regions controlled multiple neighborhoods. Coordinators controlled single neighborhoods, enforcers maintained discipline. Soldiers carried out orders, there were ranks and titles. There was a chain of command, orders flowed down, money flowed up. This structure solved several problems that plague other gangs. First, it prevented internal conflicts from tearing the organization apart. Disputes between members could be adjudicated through the hierarchy rather than devolving into shooting wars. Second, it made the organization resilient. If one leader was arrested or killed, someone else could step into that role. The organization would continue. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it made the Gangster Disciples scalable. With this structure, they could expand into new territory and maintain control. They could grow from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of members without falling into chaos. But the structure was only part of the genius. Barksdale and Hoover also understood that to maintain power, they needed more than fear. They needed loyalty, they needed ideology, so they created one. The Gangster Disciples developed a set of principles, a doctrine that members were required to learn and follow. These principles were built around concepts like loyalty, discipline, and commitment to the organization. But they also included language about community uplift and racial pride. This was the late 1960s and early 1970s. Remember, the Black Power movement was at its height. The Black Panthers were preaching community self-defense and economic independence. There was a whole vocabulary around Black liberation, Black self-determination, Black community control. Barksdale and Hoover borrowed that language. They positioned the Gangster Disciples not just as a gang, but as a community organization. They said they were protecting the Black community from outside threats. They said they were providing economic opportunities that the racist system denied. They said they were teaching young Black men discipline and pride. And here's the complicated part. In some ways, they actually did those things. The Gangster Disciples in the early 1970s did provide community services. They organized youth basketball leagues. They held back-to-school drives. They threw neighborhood parties. They employed young men who couldn't find legitimate work in neighborhoods where the government had essentially abandoned the residents. The GD filled the vacuum. I want to be very clear about something. This doesn't excuse or justify the violence, the drug dealing, the extortion, the murder. The Gangster Disciples were a criminal organization that caused immense harm. They destroyed lives, tore apart families, and perpetuated cycles of violence and trauma. But the full truth is complicated. In neighborhoods like Englewood, the GD were simultaneously a destructive force and, in some ways, a source of order and community support. They were the largest employer of young Black men. They kept some violence down by enforcing rules in their territory. They settled disputes that might have otherwise led to killings. This duality, the violence and the community programs, the destruction and the protection, is essential to understanding how Larry Hoover became such a mythic figure. He wasn't just a crime boss. He was, to many in his community, a leader, a king in fact. By the early 1970s, the Gangster Disciples had grown into a force that dominated the South Side. They had an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 members. They controlled drug markets worth millions of dollars. They had connections with suppliers, with corrupt police, with politicians. David Barksdale was the face of the organization, the charismatic leader who commanded respect through force of personality. But Larry Hoover was the architect, the strategist, the one who made sure the machine ran smoothly. And then, in 1973, everything changed. By early 1973, the Gangster Disciples were at their peak on the streets. Blue and black flags flew from porches across the South Side. Young men wore their 6-point stars with pride. Community picnics drew thousands. Free food, bouncy houses for kids, voter registration tables. Politicians who once ignored the neighborhoods now came asking for support. Behind the scenes, money flowed like never before. Drug spots operated with military precision. Protection taxes were collected quietly but firmly. The board met in safe houses debating expansion into Gary. Milwaukee, downstate Illinois, Larry Hoover, now 23, moved through the city like quiet royalty. Always calm, always listening more than speaking. Mothers in the neighborhood trusted him enough to send wayward sons to him for talking tos that sometimes saved lives. Rivals feared him not because he screamed or flashed weapons, but because his word was final. He had a young son now, Larry Jr., and talked often about wanting something better for the next generation, in private moments. He told close lieutenants he dreamed of one day turning the organization legitimate, buying buildings, starting businesses, running candidates for office. But the streets don't allow dreams to stay gentle for long. Old grudges simmered, debts went unpaid, lines got crossed. And on a cold February night in 1973, a dispute over money and respect turned deadly. Two things happened in 1973 that would alter the trajectory of both Larry Hoover's life and the Gangster Disciples' future. First, on February 26, 1973, Larry Hoover was involved in the murder of a man named William Pookie Young. The details of this murder would be debated in court, but the basic facts are these. William Young was a suspected drug dealer in Gangster Disciples territory who allegedly owed the organization money. On that February day, Young was shot and killed. Larry Hoover was arrested and charged with the murder. At trial, there were questions about the evidence, questions about witness reliability, questions about whether Hoover had pulled the trigger or ordered it or was even present. But ultimately, Larry Hoover was convicted of murder. The judge sentenced him to 150 to 200 years in prison. 150 to 200 years for a 23-year-old man. It was effectively a life sentence several times over. Larry Hoover entered the Illinois prison system in 1973. He would never be a free man again. Most criminal organizations would collapse when their leadership goes to prison. The structure falls apart, rivals move in, the empire crumbles. But the Gangster Disciples didn't collapse. They didn't even weaken. Because of the structure Barksdale and Hoover had built. Because of the ideology they'd instilled. Because of the loyalty they'd cultivated. And because, even from behind bars, Larry Hoover remained in command. The second major event of 1973 was David Barksdale's declining health. In 1970, Barksdale had been shot multiple times in a gang-related attack. He survived, but his health never fully recovered. By 1973, he was suffering from complications from his injuries, including kidney problems, with Hoover in prison and Barksdale's health failing. The Gangster Disciples faced their first true leadership crisis. But the structure they built was designed to handle exactly this situation. The board of directors continued to function. The hierarchy remained intact. Orders continued to flow from the imprisoned Hoover through a network of visitors, lawyers, and coded messages. This is crucial to understand. Larry Hoover didn't stop being a leader just because he went to prison. In fact, his imprisonment may have actually enhanced his mystique and power. In prison, Hoover became untouchable by rivals. He couldn't be killed in a drive-by shooting or ambushed on a street corner. The concrete walls that imprisoned him also protected him. Meanwhile, he had 24 hours a day to think, to plan, to strategize. He had time to study, to learn, to develop his philosophy, and he had a captive audience. Illinois prisons were full of Gangster Disciples members. When Hoover was transferred between prisons, word spread instantly through the inmate population. He was royalty, even behind bars, especially behind bars. The mid to late 1970s marked the transformation of the Gangster Disciples from a Chicago gang into a national organization. And all of it happened under the leadership of a man behind bars. Larry Hoover's leadership style was different from David Barksdale's. Barksdale had been charismatic and hands-on. a street leader who led by example and personal presence. Hoover, necessarily operating from prison, led through structure, through ideology. Through the force of his reputation, he became a mythic figure, larger than life. Stories about King Larry spread through the South Side and beyond. His intelligence, his strategic brilliance, his unshakable calm under pressure, the fact that he could run an empire from a prison cell only added to the legend. Inside the stark walls of Stateville Correctional Center in the late 1970s, Hoover transformed isolation into a classroom. With unlimited time and access to the prison library, he immersed himself in works on leadership and organization, biographies of historical figures, studies of corporate hierarchies, even analyses of military command structures. He drew parallels between successful empires and what the GD could become: resilient, disciplined, enduring beyond any single leader. His handwritten memos, tight script on legal pads, circulated as literature, smuggled out through visitors or trusted inmates. These pages outlined refinements to the structure, philosophical principles, and warnings against disunity on the streets. Young members treated them with reverence, reciting passages at dimly lit meetings in abandoned lots or basements, feeling directly connected to the unseen chairman. The legend grew through whispered stories, how Hoover orchestrated truces from his cell, predicted rival moves years ahead, or maintained iron control despite transfers designed to isolate him. Rivals and other gangs spoke of him with grudging respect. "You can't touch a king locked in a fortress" for GD members. His imprisonment symbolized unbreakable strength. The nation thrived because its foundation was ideology and hierarchy, not just one man's presence, even as violence raged outside. Hoover's calm directives emphasized long-term vision. In one documented memo, he urged, "We must grow beyond the streets, educate, organize, develop." This intellectual evolution elevated him from street boss to philosopher king, inspiring loyalty that spanned generations and state lines. But it wasn't just myth. Hoover was genuinely brilliant at organization. He refined the structure of the Gangster Disciples even further. He established written rules and regulations, a constitution for the organization. Yes, a gang with a constitution. This document laid out the principles of the organization, the duties of members at each rank, the procedures for discipline, and the process for making major decisions. New members had to learn this constitution. They had to memorize the principles of the Gangster Disciples. They had to swear oaths of loyalty. It was almost like joining a secret society or a military organization. The Constitution included the organizational structure, the chairman, Hoover himself, the board of directors, the governors, the regents, the coordinators, and on down through the ranks. Every member knew their place in the hierarchy. Every member knew who they reported to and who reported to them. This structure allowed the GD to expand dramatically during the 1970s. They spread across Chicago's South Side and West Side. They moved into the suburbs. They established chapters in other Illinois cities. And then they began expanding into other states entirely. By the late 1970s, there were Gangster Disciple sets in Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Missouri, anywhere young black men from Chicago had migrated or had family connections. The GD followed. The expansion was deliberate and strategic. Hoover didn't just want random groups in other cities claiming to be GD. He wanted real organizational control, so he sent trusted members to establish new chapters, to recruit, to set up the same hierarchical structure, to ensure loyalty to the central organization. It worked. By the end of the 1970s, the Gangster Disciples had evolved from a Chicago street gang into something more like a criminal corporation with franchises across the Midwest. And they were making incredible amounts of money. The drug trade was exploding in the 1970s. Heroin had been profitable. But cocaine was becoming the drug of choice in urban America. And in the 1980s, crack cocaine would turn the drug trade into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The Gangster Disciples were perfectly positioned to capitalize on this. Their organizational structure meant they could control drug distribution across large territories. They had the muscle to eliminate competition. They had the numbers to staff a complex distribution network. And they had the discipline to handle large amounts of money without the organization falling into chaos. Estimates of the Gangster Disciples' revenue during their peak years vary, but law enforcement sources have suggested annual revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Some estimates go even higher. Where did all that money go? Some went to members. The GD paid people at every level. Soldiers making street sales got a cut. Coordinators controlling neighborhoods got a larger cut. Governors controlling regions got a substantial income. It was a pyramid with money flowing up to the leadership. Some went to lawyers. The GD needed a lot of lawyers. Members were getting arrested constantly. And the organization prided itself on taking care of its own. If you got arrested doing GD business, the organization would pay for your legal defense. This policy bought incredible loyalty. Some went to bribes, police officers, prison guards, judges. Anyone who could be bought was targeted. Not everyone could be corrupted, but enough could that the GD operated with a significant advantage. Some went to guns and weapons. The GD was constantly at war with rival gangs, particularly the Black P-Stones and later the Vice Lords. Maintaining military superiority required investment in weapons, and some went to community programs. This is another aspect of the Gangster Disciples that makes them so complicated to understand. Even as they were dealing drugs that destroyed lives, even as they were committing murders, they were also investing in their communities. The GD ran youth programs, they provided scholarships, they threw community events, they helped families pay bills. In neighborhoods where there was no social safety net, the GD became one. This wasn't entirely altruistic. These community programs bought loyalty and legitimacy. They made it harder for law enforcement to get community cooperation. When the police are trying to arrest the same people who just paid for your son's school clothes or your grandmother's medical bills, it's complicated, but whatever the motivation, the programs were real, and they made Larry Hoover something more than just a crime boss to many people in his community. They made him a leader, a provider, a king. Hoover himself was developing intellectually during these years. In prison, he had access to libraries. He read voraciously. History, politics, philosophy, business management. He studied successful organizations, both legal and illegal. He looked at how corporations were structured, how military units operated, how political movements organized. He incorporated these lessons into the Gangster Disciples. The GD adopted increasingly sophisticated organizational practices. They held regular meetings at various levels of the organization. They kept records, coded of course, but detailed. They established disciplinary procedures. They created incentive structures to reward loyalty and performance. It was almost like an MBA program for gang leadership. Hoover also began developing the ideological component of the organization more fully. The GD principles became more elaborate, more philosophical. Hoover wrote extensively about concepts like growth and development, which is where the abbreviation GD would later be reinterpreted to mean not Gangster Disciples, but growth and development. This wasn't just propaganda. Hoover seemed to genuinely believe, or at least to have convinced himself, that the Gangster Disciples could evolve into something legitimate, that they could become a political and economic force for the black community, using the power and resources they'd accumulated through illegal means as a foundation for legal enterprises and community development. This vision led to one of the most interesting and controversial periods in Gangster Disciples history, their move into politics. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Chicago politics were undergoing a transformation. The old democratic machine was weakening. The black community was becoming more politically organized and demanding a greater share of political power. In 1983, Harold Washington became Chicago's first black mayor, winning in an election that galvanized black Chicago and terrified white Chicago. His victory showed that the black community, if organized and unified, could wield real political power. The Gangster Disciples paid attention. Hoover began directing the organization to engage in political activity. The GD started registering voters. They organized campaign volunteers. They held political education meetings in their territories in the 1980s. They created a coalition called 21st Century Vote, voices organized together for empowerment. On paper, this was a community organization focused on political engagement and community development. In reality, it was a GD-front organization, a way for the gang to build political influence and legitimacy. 21st Century Vote did real political work. They registered thousands of voters. They brought people to the polls. They organized community meetings about local issues. Political candidates actually sought their endorsement. This is one of the strangest aspects of the Larry Hoover story. Here's a man serving a 150 to 200-year sentence for murder, leading a criminal organization responsible for countless acts of violence, and simultaneously organizing voter registration drives and political campaigns. How do you make sense of that? Some people saw it as cynical manipulation, a crime boss wrapping himself in the language of community, empowerment to gain power and deflect law enforcement attention. Others saw it as genuine evolution, a leader trying to transform his organization from criminal enterprise to political movement. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Hoover's vision seemed to be that the Gangster Disciples could become something like the political machines of earlier eras. Tammany Hall, the Chicago Democratic Machine, organizations that wielded power through a combination of patronage, community service, muscle, and political influence. These earlier machines had been corrupt, sometimes violent, but they'd also been integrated into the legitimate political system. Why couldn't the GD follow that path? The problem, of course, was that the GD's criminal activity was too extensive and too violent to simply be overlooked or absorbed into the system. They weren't just engaged in low-level graft and patronage. They were major drug dealers. They were killing people. They were running a criminal empire. No amount of voter registration drives could wash that away. But for a period in the 1980s, there was a strange duality to the Gangster Disciples. In some neighborhoods, they were simultaneously the greatest threat to public safety and the most effective community organization. They were dealing drugs on one corner and running a job training program 2 blocks away. And at the center of this contradiction was Larry Hoover, a king ruling from a cage during this period. Hoover was transferred between various Illinois prisons as authorities tried to limit his ability to communicate with the outside world. But it was a futile effort. The GD had members in every prison. Hoover's influence was inescapable within the Illinois Department of Corrections. In fact, prison became a crucial part of the GD's structure. When members were incarcerated, they joined the GD prison organization. The hierarchy continued behind bars. Orders flowed from Hoover through the prison organization to the streets. This created a situation where prison, supposedly a punishment, actually strengthened the gang. Young members who might have drifted away from the gang on the streets were locked into the organization when they went to prison, and they came out more committed, more indoctrinated, more connected. It was a vicious cycle. The more people law enforcement arrested, the more the gang grew. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement estimates put Gangster Disciples membership at over 30,000 people. 30,000, that's larger than some towns. That's a small army, and all of them, in theory, answered to Larry Hoover. The scope of what Hoover had built was unprecedented. No gang leader in American history had created an organization this large, this structured, this far-reaching. While imprisoned, he truly had become King Larry, and the Gangster Disciples were his empire. But empires don't last forever, and the larger they grow, the harder they fall. The federal government was watching, and they were starting to understand that to truly destroy the Gangster Disciples, they needed to do more than just arrest members. They needed to cut off the head. The problem was, the head was already in prison, serving a sentence of 150 to 200 years. How do you stop someone who's already locked away for life? That question would define the next phase of Larry Hoover's story. And the answer would involve some of the most aggressive federal law enforcement tactics ever deployed against a street gang. To truly understand what Larry Hoover built, you need to understand that the Gangster Disciples at their peak weren't just a gang. They were a nation within a nation, a parallel society with its own rules, its own economy, its own culture. Let's talk about the structure in detail, because it's remarkable. At the very top was Larry Hoover himself, the chairman, the king. Even though he was imprisoned, his word was law. The organization existed to serve his vision and follow his direction. Immediately below Hoover was the board of directors, sometimes called the board of governors. This was typically composed of about 15 to 20 of the most senior and trusted members. These men had proven their loyalty over years or even decades. Many of them had been with the organization since the Devil's Disciples days. The board made major strategic decisions. They couldn't override Hoover, but they could discuss issues, provide input, and sometimes make decisions on matters Hoover delegated to them. They met regularly, though these meetings had to be carefully arranged to avoid law enforcement surveillance. Below the board were the governors. Each governor controlled a large geographic region, multiple neighborhoods, or even entire cities outside Chicago. A governor might oversee hundreds or even thousands of members. They had significant autonomy in how they ran their region, as long as they followed overall organizational rules and sent money up the chain. Below governors were regents. A regent typically controlled a neighborhood or a section of a city. They were responsible for coordinating all GD activity in their area: drug sales, recruitment, discipline, enforcement. Regents had to be smart, tough, and trustworthy. This was a position of real power. Below regents were coordinators. A coordinator might control a few blocks or a housing project. They supervised the actual street-level operations. And then there were enforcers, also called security or shorties. These were the soldiers, the muscle. They did the actual work, selling drugs, collecting money, fighting rivals, enforcing rules. This structure was formalized in the GD Constitution, which by the 1980s had evolved into a detailed document. New members had to learn it. Higher-ranking members had to teach it. It covered everything. The laws of the organization: never snitch, never cooperate with police, never disrespect the chairman, never steal from the organization, etc. The responsibilities of each rank, the process for promotion, the disciplinary procedures for members who broke rules, the procedures for conducting business, the ideological principles of the organization. The GD even had a system of laws that members could be charged with violating, and courts where these violations would be adjudicated. If you were accused of stealing from the organization, you'd be brought before a council of higher-ranking members. They'd hear evidence, question witnesses, and render a verdict if you were found guilty. Punishment could range from beatings, called violations. They'd literally violate you with fists, to being put off the count, kicked out of the organization, to, in serious cases, death. This system of internal justice served multiple purposes. It maintained discipline, which was essential for an organization of this size. It provided a mechanism for resolving disputes that might otherwise lead to internal warfare. And it gave members a sense that there was order, that they weren't just part of random street violence, but part of something structured and principled. The Gangster Disciples also developed an elaborate symbolic system. The six-pointed star became the primary GD symbol. The 6 points represented the 6 original members of the organization's founding, or in other interpretations, 6 principles: love, life, loyalty, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. GD members would throw up hand signs forming a 6-pointed star. They'd write it on walls as graffiti. They'd wear jewelry shaped like 6-pointed stars. The numbers 7 and 4 were significant, as the 7th and 4th letter combination spelled GD. Members would sometimes identify themselves with 74. The colors black and blue represented the organization. Members would wear these colors, especially in combination. The pitchfork pointing upward was another key symbol. It represented the Folks Alliance. More on that in a moment. There was a GD prayer, a formal statement of the organization's principles that members memorized. As I stand in the midst of my fellow brothers, I pledge my love to the brotherhood above all others. I pledge my life to the Gangster Disciples. If I should fall, my brothers will carry on, and so on. It was elaborate, almost religious in its language. Members also learned the GD alphabet, a coded system for communication. Letters were represented by symbols or alternative letters, allowing members to write messages that looked like gibberish to outsiders, but could be decoded by other GD members. This symbolic system served several functions. It created a shared identity and culture. It allowed for semi-covert communication. And it made members feel like they were part of something special, something with history and meaning. The GD also developed a complex system of alliances with other gangs in the Chicago gang world. Organizations were divided into 2 main coalitions, Folks and People. The Gangster Disciples were the dominant gang in the Folks Alliance, which also included the Black Disciples, a splinter group from the original Devil's Disciples, the Latin Disciples, the Spanish Cobras, and various other gangs. The Folks Alliance used the 6-pointed star and the pitchfork as symbols. The People Alliance, led by the Black P. Stones, and including the Vice Lords, El Ruckins, Latin Kings, and others, used the 5-pointed star and opposed the Folks. These alliances weren't formal treaties exactly, but they created a framework. Folks gangs generally didn't war with each other, and they united against People gangs. This system reduced some violence by limiting the number of potential enemies. But it also meant that when violence did occur, it could be massive, involving multiple gangs on each side. The Gangster Disciples, as the most powerful Folks gang, often acted as a leadership organization for the whole alliance. Larry Hoover's influence extended beyond just GD members to the broader Folks coalition. During the 1980s, the GD empire was at its absolute peak. They controlled significant portions of Chicago's south and west sides. They had active chapters in dozens of cities across at least 15 states. Conservative estimates put membership at 30,000. Some estimates went as high as 50,000 or even higher. The money flowing through the organization was staggering. Federal prosecutors would later estimate that at its peak, the GD's drug trafficking operations generated over $100 million annually. Some estimates went much higher. Think about what that means. $100 million a year. That's the revenue of a mid-sized company. Except this company was a criminal organization led by a man in prison. The GD weren't just selling drugs on street corners anymore. They developed sophisticated trafficking operations. They had connections to major drug suppliers, Colombian cocaine traffickers, Mexican cartels. They had transportation networks to move drugs across state lines. They had money laundering operations to handle the massive cash flows. They'd also diversified beyond drugs. The GD were involved in robbery, carjacking, fraud, weapons trafficking, and various other criminal enterprises. Some members ran legitimate businesses that served as fronts or money laundering operations. And through all of this, Larry Hoover remained in command. Orchestrating operations from prison, how did he do it? The communications network was surprisingly sophisticated. Hoover would receive visits from lawyers who could communicate with him in private, attorney-client privilege. Messages would be passed through these lawyers to the outside. Hoover also used family members as messengers. His mother, his children, other relatives would visit, and they'd relay information in prison. Hoover communicated with other GD members through various means. Sometimes it was direct, in facilities where he had contact with other inmates. He could pass messages. Other times it was indirect, coded letters. Messages passed through a chain of inmates and guards. Some prison officials were corrupted. Guards would pass messages or allow illegal communications in exchange for money. Prison staff who weren't corrupt often looked the other way, either out of fear or apathy. The Illinois Department of Corrections tried repeatedly to isolate Hoover, but it was like trying to stop water from flowing. The GD network was too extensive. Too motivated, too resourced, messages always got through. And Hoover's mystique only grew the longer he remained in prison while still controlling the organization. The more legendary he became, he was proof that the GD was bigger than any one person. That the organization could survive anything in the neighborhoods controlled by the GD. Larry Hoover was spoken of in almost mythical terms. King Larry, the man who built an empire from a cell. The man who never snitched, never cooperated, never broke. The man who took care of his people even from prison. Young black men growing up in poverty, facing limited opportunities, seeing the legitimate world as hostile and closed to them, looked at Larry Hoover and saw power, saw success, saw someone who'd made it from nothing. The Gangster Disciples recruiting was incredibly effective during this period. They didn't just wait for people to join. They actively recruited in schools, in neighborhoods, in youth programs. They made joining the GD seem attractive. You'd have protection, respect, money, purpose, brotherhood, and they made it clear that refusing to join could be dangerous. In neighborhoods where the GD was dominant, young men often felt they had no choice. You were either with them or against them, and being against them was hazardous to your health. This is one of the most tragic aspects of the GD's impact. They effectively drafted young men into a life of crime. Teenagers who might have had a chance at a legitimate life were pulled into an organization that would likely land them in prison or a grave. The GD also had a significant presence in schools. They recruited in high schools and even middle schools. They used intimidation to control school environments. Teachers and administrators often felt powerless to stop them. In some Chicago schools during the 1980s and 1990s, the GD effectively ran the building. They controlled who could move through the hallways, who could use certain bathrooms, who could sit at certain lunch tables. Students who weren't affiliated often felt terrorized. This wasn't just about crime, it was about power, control, and creating the next generation of members. The GD's influence extended into prisons in a major way. In Illinois prisons, the GD were the dominant gang in many facilities. They outnumbered all other gangs combined. This gave them enormous power over prison life. They could control contraband markets, drugs, weapons, phones. They could provide protection to affiliated inmates. They could make life hell for enemies. Even prison staff had to navigate GD power dynamics. And Larry Hoover was at the center of it all. In whichever prison he was held, he was royalty. Other inmates sought his favor. Guards knew his name. His word could start or stop violence across the entire prison system. This prison power had a feedback loop with street power. Young men on the streets knew that if they got locked up, they'd be protected if they were GD. Rival gang members knew they'd be vulnerable in prison if their gang didn't have strong numbers inside. So the GD's prison dominance helped with recruitment on the streets, which increased their prison numbers, which reinforced their dominance, and on and on. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Gangster Disciples were at a level of power that few American gangs had ever reached. They were comparable to the great organized crime syndicates of earlier eras, the mafia families, the Irish mobs, the Jewish gangs. But there was a crucial difference. All of those earlier organizations had, to some degree, been integrated into or tolerated by the political system. Corrupt officials worked with them. Legitimate businesses partnered with them. They operated in a gray zone between legal and illegal, the Gangster Disciples. As a predominantly black organization in the era of the war on drugs and mass incarceration, didn't have that luxury. They were targeted for destruction by law enforcement at every level. Which brings us to the next phase of our story. The empire had reached its peak, but the forces gathering against it were formidable, and they were about to make their move. By the 1990s, the Gangster Disciples had become law enforcement's white whale. Local police, the FBI, the D, federal prosecutors, everyone wanted to take down the GD. But how do you destroy an organization of 30,000 people? How do you stop a leader who's already serving a sentence of 150 to 200 years? The traditional approach to gang enforcement wasn't working. Police would arrest street-level dealers and shooters, but there were always more to replace them. The structure that Larry Hoover had built was too resilient, too deep, too self-sustaining. Law enforcement needed a new strategy. They needed to attack the organization itself, not just its members. And they needed to make sure Larry Hoover could never lead again. The tool they would use was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO was passed in 1970 as a way to fight the mafia. The genius of RICO is that it doesn't just prosecute individual crimes. It prosecutes the existence of a criminal organization itself under RICO. If you can prove that an organization exists for criminal purposes and that someone participated in that organization, you can charge them with racketeering, even if you can't tie them to any specific crime. For the Gangster Disciples, this was potentially devastating. In the early 1990s, federal prosecutors and the FBI began building a massive RICO case against the GD. It would take years. They needed to prove that the Gangster Disciples was an ongoing criminal enterprise, that this enterprise engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity, that Larry Hoover and other leaders directed this enterprise. To do this, they needed evidence, lots of evidence. Federal investigators conducted an operation called Operation Headache, though there were several other related investigations. They used wiretaps, surveillance, informants, undercover officers, and financial records analysis. Operation Headache, launched in the early 1990s as a joint FBI, ATF, and Chicago police effort, represented a seismic shift in gang prosecution. For years, agents infiltrated GD ranks posing as dealers, recording prison visits with hidden devices and visitor badges, flipping arrested members with plea deals. They mapped the empire, drug routes from suppliers, money flows to prison accounts benefiting Hoover's family, violent informants, often facing decades themselves. Detailed board meetings in safe houses, coded directives from Hoover. Handle that problem meant eliminate threats. Wiretaps on payphones and smuggled cells captured governors discussing taxes on street sales. Orders traced back to the chairman. The probe exposed how GD nonprofits like 21st Century Vote sometimes funneled drug cash. Voter drives, legitimate on surface, but intertwined with empire finances. Raids seized ledgers listing thousands of members. Revenue breakdowns, risks were immense. Suspected snitches executed. Families threatened, but persistence paid off. By summer 1995, after 6 years and millions spent, the case was airtight, proving GD as a racketeering enterprise under RICO. With Hoover directing from Vienna Correctional Center. On August 31, 1995, dawn raids swept Chicago. Over 250 agents, arresting dozens. Hoover, transferred to federal custody, faced the indictment that finally aimed to sever his invisible hand from the streets. The challenge was enormous. The GD was sophisticated. They used coded language. They were disciplined about what they said on phones. They had counter-surveillance measures. They murdered informants. But the investigators were patient and thorough. They started low in the organization and worked their way up. They'd arrest street-level members and offer them deals. Testify against your superiors or face decades in prison. Some refused and went to prison, but some took the deals. Every cooperating witness gave them information about the next level up. Coordinators could testify about regents. Regents could testify about governors, and slowly, painstakingly, they built a case that reached all the way to Larry Hoover. The investigators also got lucky in the mid-1990s. They managed to get court authorization for wiretaps on phones used by high-ranking GD members. These wiretaps captured explicit conversations about drug deals, violence, and organizational business. More importantly, they captured conversations about Larry Hoover's continued leadership. They got evidence of messages coming from Hoover, orders being carried out on his behalf, money being sent to his family. This was gold. This was what they needed to prove that Hoover wasn't just a figurehead, but an active leader, continuing to direct a criminal enterprise from prison. But even as investigators were building their case, the GD continued to operate, and the violence was getting worse. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and early 1990s had turned drug dealing into an incredibly lucrative, but also incredibly violent business. Disputes over territory could erupt into shooting wars. The GD were involved in countless murders, both of rival gang members and of people within their own organization who were suspected of betrayal or stealing. Chicago's murder rate soared in 1991. There were 927 murders in Chicago. In 1992, there were 943. A significant percentage of these were gang-related, and the GD were involved in many of them. The public pressure was intense. Communities were terrified. Politicians were demanding action, and law enforcement was determined to deliver. In 1995, federal prosecutors made their move. Larry Hoover and 38 other high-ranking Gangster Disciples members were indicted on federal racketeering charges. The indictment was massive, over 100 pages, detailing decades of criminal activity. The charges against Hoover included conspiracy to engage in racketeering, continuing to engage in a criminal enterprise, drug conspiracy, using interstate commerce to facilitate unlawful activity. If convicted, Hoover faced additional life sentences on top of the 150 to 200 years he was already serving. The prosecution's case was built on testimony from dozens of former GD members who had become cooperating witnesses, physical evidence from raids and seizures, and those crucial wiretaps showing Hoover's continued involvement. The defense faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend a client who's already in prison for murder against charges that he continued to run a criminal organization from prison? How do you explain away wiretaps, informant testimony, documentary evidence? Larry Hoover's lawyers argued that he had disavowed the gang's criminal activity, that he had been trying to transform the GD into a legitimate community organization, that any messages from him were about peaceful community development, not crime. They pointed to 21st Century Vote and other community programs. They brought in character witnesses who testified about Hoover's intelligence, his reading habits, his evolution in prison, his sincere desire to help his community. But the prosecution had too much evidence. Witness after witness testified that Hoover remained the absolute leader of the GD, that his word was law, that orders came from him through various intermediaries to the streets, that money flowed from drug sales up the chain, eventually reaching Hoover's family members. One particularly damaging witness was a former high-ranking GD member who'd become an informant. He testified in detail about the organization's structure, about meetings he'd attended where Hoover's orders were discussed, about the system of coded messages. The wiretaps were devastating. Though Hoover was careful and used coded language, the context made it clear what was being discussed. References to work meant drugs. References to problems meant violence. And the conversation showed a clear chain of command leading back to Hoover. The prosecution also introduced evidence of the GD's violence, murders, assaults, intimidation. They brought in victims and family members of victims. They showed photos of crime scenes, of young men killed in gang wars. The human cost of the Gangster Disciples empire was on full display. The trial took months. The jury heard from over 100 witnesses. They reviewed thousands of pages of documents. They listened to dozens of hours of wiretaps. And in 1997, they reached a verdict: guilty. Larry Hoover was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 6 life sentences, to be served consecutively with his existing 150 to 200-year sentence. Larry Hoover, at 47 years old, was now serving what effectively amounted to multiple life sentences. He would never be free. The judge made that explicitly clear. Hoover would die in prison, but the case wasn't just about Hoover. The other 38 defendants in the RICO case were also convicted. The entire leadership structure of the Gangster Disciples had been dismantled. Governors were going to prison for decades. Regents were going away for life. The board of directors was destroyed. Law enforcement had done what seemed impossible. They'd cut the head off the snake, but would it work? Would the Gangster Disciples finally collapse without their leadership? The answer was complicated. In the short term, the GD were definitely disrupted. The mass arrests and prosecutions created chaos in the organization. Without their traditional leadership, different factions began fighting for control. Violence actually increased temporarily as various people tried to fill the power vacuum. But the structure that Hoover had built proved remarkably resilient. New leaders emerged. The hierarchy reformed. Though in a more fragmented way, the organization continued. Though without the centralized control it had once had. This raised an interesting question. Had the GD become bigger than Larry Hoover? Had he built something that could survive even his permanent removal? In a way, yes, the Gangster Disciples continued to operate in Chicago and other cities. They remained a significant criminal organization, but they were never the same. The unified empire that Hoover had created fractured into semi-independent sets. The ideological component weakened. The community programs largely disappeared. What remained was more purely criminal. Drug dealing, violence, street-level crime. The transformation that Hoover had always claimed he wanted, from gang to legitimate community organization, became impossible. Post-1997, GD splintered. Rival factions in Chicago vied for control, sparking temporary violence spikes as old alliances fractured. Sets in other states drifted independent. A centralized nation dissolving into loose affiliations, sharing symbols but not command. Community programs faded. Basketball leagues, voter drives. Unsupported without top-down funding. What endured was street-level crime, drug spots, territorial beefs, no overarching ideology binding thousands. Hoover's blueprint proved double-edged. Resilient enough to survive leadership decapitation, but without his strategic oversight. Devolving into fragmented, purely criminal entities. Law enforcement noted reduced large-scale coordination. Fewer multi-state operations, yet the brand persisted. 6-point stars on walls, 74 tags, symbolic loyalty lingering. Especially among younger members romanticizing King Larry's legend. And Larry Hoover himself was about to face an even harsher punishment. In the aftermath of his conviction, federal authorities decided that even prison wasn't secure enough. Hoover had proven that he could lead an organization from behind bars. Regular prison couldn't contain his influence. So they sent him to a DX Florence, the Supermax, America's most secure prison, the place where the nation's most dangerous criminals go to disappear. For over 25 years, Larry Hoover lived in what many called a clean version of hell. ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado's high desert, designed to house the nation's most dangerous inmates, isolated them completely. 23 hours a day in a 7 by 12 foot concrete cell. Solid steel door, tiny slot for food, a narrow window showing only sky. 1 hour of recreation alone in a concrete pen, showers 3 times a week. No group activities, minimal human contact. Psychological experts compare extended stays to torture. That was Larry Hoover's reality from the late 1990s until May 2025, when President Trump commuted his federal life sentences. The commutation ended his supermax confinement and transferred him to an Illinois state facility to serve out his original 150 to 200-year murder sentence from 1973. ADX Florence, opened 1994, housed America's most controlled threats. Terrorists, mob bosses, Hoover among them, his unit, underground or windowless cells. Constant fluorescent light, meals through slots. Recreation in solitary dog runs. Advocates documented the toll, reported health declines. Sensory deprivation effects, Hoover completed programs. Maintained clean record, but isolation absolute. Monitored calls, visits rare, momentum built in the 2020s via hip-hop. Kanye West's 2018 Oval Office plea to Trump. Features on tracks with Larry Jr.'s message on justice flaws. 2021 Free Larry Hoover benefit concert with Drake at LA Coliseum. Drawing millions viewing, proceeds to reform groups. May 28, 2025. Trump commuted federal sentences, citing age, 75. Time served, approximately 52 years total. Rehabilitation claims, Hoover left a DX shortly after. Transferred amid health concerns, reported heart issues to Illinois custody. State sentence intact, parole distant. Clemency petitions to Governor Pritzker. PRB ongoing but facing opposition. As of late 2025, Hoover, elderly and frail, remains imprisoned. Advocates pushing mercy for senior prisoners, pre-1978 cases. Critics citing GD's lasting harm, the extreme isolation is over. But Hoover, now 75, remains imprisoned. Parole petitions ongoing but repeatedly denied as of late 2025. The concrete tomb of a DX is behind him, but the weight of half a century in custody is not. The psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement are well documented. Studies have shown that extended isolation can cause anxiety and panic attacks, depression, hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive decline, memory problems, hypersensitivity to stimuli, loss of the ability to socialize, suicidal ideation. Some researchers compare it to torture. The United Nations has said that solitary confinement exceeding 15 days may constitute torture. Larry Hoover has been in effective solitary for over 25 years. But this was exactly what federal authorities wanted. They wanted to isolate him so completely that he couldn't possibly continue to lead the Gangster Disciples. They wanted to break his ability to communicate, to influence, to control. Did it work? The answer is complicated and honestly depends on who you ask. Federal prosecutors would say yes, it absolutely worked. Hoover's ability to lead the GD was eliminated. The communications networks he'd relied on in Illinois state prisons were impossible to replicate in the Supermax. His influence over the organization declined dramatically. But others aren't so sure, even from a DX, even under those extreme conditions. Hoover has maintained some level of communication with the outside world. He's allowed very limited phone calls to family members. Heavily monitored, restricted in length and frequency. But they exist. He can write letters, though they're read by prison authorities. He can receive visits from family and lawyers. Though these are strictly controlled and monitored, and somehow messages get through, there have been allegations over the years that Hoover continues to exert some influence over the GD. Even from the Supermax, law enforcement officials have claimed they've intercepted coded messages. Some former GD members have testified that Hoover's wishes are still respected, that his status as the founder and original king means he still has symbolic authority. But even if that's true, it's nothing like the direct control he once had. The Gangster Disciples in the 21st century are fragmented, decentralized, more like a brand or an identity than a unified organization. Many sets operate independently. The name Gangster Disciples means different things in different cities. In Chicago, there are multiple factions claiming to be the real GD, sometimes warring with each other. The organizational structure that Hoover built has largely dissolved. So while Hoover may retain some symbolic importance, his practical power has been destroyed. The question is, at what cost? The human cost of keeping Larry Hoover in these conditions is significant. Even if you believe his original crimes justified imprisonment, Hoover is now in his 70s. He's been in prison for over 50 years, longer than many people live. He's been in extreme isolation for over 2 decades. He's had minimal physical contact with other human beings. He's missed his children growing up, missed births of grandchildren, missed funerals of family members. His mother, who was a regular visitor and remained devoted to him throughout his incarceration, passed away. He couldn't attend her funeral. He grieved alone in his cell. His children have struggled with their father's absence and infamy. His son, Larry Hoover Jr., has become his most vocal advocate, campaigning for his release and trying to rehabilitate his father's image. But that advocacy has been complicated by Larry Hoover Jr.'s own legal troubles. In 2018, Hoover Jr. was arrested on federal money laundering charges, allegedly trying to hide income for the GD. He eventually pleaded guilty and served time in federal prison himself. The family's argument is that Larry Hoover Jr.'s situation proves that the cycle continues, that his father's imprisonment didn't break the pattern, that the system created the problem it now condemns. But prosecutors saw it differently, that even after decades, even from the Supermax, Hoover's influence and the GD's legacy continued to harm the next generation. The conditions at a DX have been challenged in court by various inmates and advocacy groups. They argue that the extreme isolation constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, that it causes lasting psychological damage, that it's inhumane. Prison officials defend a DX as necessary. They point to the inmates housed there: Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber; Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber; Johar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber; and numerous other terrorists, crime bosses, and extremely dangerous criminals. These are people who, in any other facility, would pose serious security risks. Larry Hoover is housed alongside these individuals, treated as one of the most dangerous criminals in America. Is he? At this point in his life, in his 70s, after half a century in prison, is Larry Hoover still a threat that requires this level of security? That's one of the central questions in the debate over his potential release. From a DX Florence, Hoover has maintained his innocence of any ongoing criminal activity. Through his lawyers and family, he's argued that he's been trying to steer the GD away from crime for decades, that his actions were mischaracterized, that he's a changed man who poses no threat. He's pointed to his lack of disciplinary infractions in prison. He's emphasized his age and health. He's argued that he served more time than almost anyone for similar charges. But federal prosecutors have consistently opposed any reduction in his sentence or transfer to less restrictive conditions. They've argued that Hoover's crimes were extraordinarily serious, that he directed an organization responsible for numerous murders and untold destruction in communities, that releasing him or easing his conditions would send the wrong message. The debate reached a new level of intensity in the 2020s when Hoover's case became a cause celebre championed by hip-hop artists. Kanye West championed Hoover since 2018, lobbying Trump directly, framing him as a reform symbol. Drake joined for the 2021 concert. Sold out, streamed, uniting rivals for prison justice awareness. Larry Hoover Jr., vocal in interviews, day appearances, decrying generational cycles, father's absence, yet complicated by past legal issues tied to alleged GD finances, underscoring prosecutors' view that legacy endures. Hip-hop reframed narrative from villain to reformed elder. Critique of mass incarceration. Tracks referenced Hoover as a resilience icon. Debates raged on redemption versus accountability. Larry Hoover has become something of a folk hero in certain circles, particularly in hip-hop culture, and that's complicated, because it speaks to something important about American society, about how we think about crime, punishment, race, and power. Hip-hop has always had a complicated relationship with gang culture. Many rappers came from gang backgrounds. Gang life has been a frequent subject in rap lyrics, sometimes glorified, sometimes condemned, usually portrayed as a complex reality of life in certain communities. And within that culture, Larry Hoover occupies a special place. He's been referenced by some of the biggest names in hip-hop: Kanye West, Drake, J. Cole, Rick Ross, and many others have mentioned him in songs. The references are usually respectful, sometimes reverential. Why? Part of it is simply that Hoover's story is dramatic and impressive in a purely technical sense. He built one of the most successful criminal organizations in history while in prison. That's remarkable, regardless of how you feel about the morality of it. But there's more to it than that. In hip-hop culture and in many black communities, there's a deep skepticism of the criminal justice system. This skepticism is earned. The system has been demonstrably racist, has incarcerated black men at vastly disproportionate rates, has enforced drug laws selectively, has destroyed black communities in the name of law and order. In that context, someone like Larry Hoover can be seen not just as a criminal, but as a rebel, a resistance figure, someone who built power in a system designed to deny power to people who look like him. The fact that he's been in prison for 50+ years, many of them in extreme isolation, can seem excessive, even cruel, especially when compared to white-collar criminals or even violent offenders who serve far less time. And Hoover's attempts at political organization, at community programs, at transforming the GD into something legitimate, however cynical those attempts may have been, resonate with people who want to believe in redemption and transformation. So when someone like Kanye West starts advocating for Hoover's release, he's tapping into all of these complicated feelings. In December 2021, Kanye West, now known as the, held a benefit concert at the Los Angeles Coliseum, explicitly advocating for Larry Hoover's freedom. He brought J. Cole on stage. He brought Drake, ending a long-running feud between them, united in support of Hoover. The concert was live-streamed globally. Millions of people watched at various points. Hoover's voice was played. Recordings from phone calls where he spoke about his desire for freedom, his claims of reform, his insistence that he wasn't the monster he'd been portrayed as. Larry Hoover Jr. spoke at the event, making an emotional appeal for his father's release. He described his father as a political prisoner, as someone who'd been unfairly demonized, as a man who deserved a second chance. The event was controversial. Supporters saw it as raising awareness about criminal justice reform, about excessive sentences, about the possibility of redemption. Critics saw it as glorifying the crime boss, as ignoring the victims of the Gangster Disciples' violence. as celebrity privilege being used to advocate for someone who didn't deserve it. The families of people killed in GD-related violence were particularly outraged. They felt erased, forgotten. Their loved ones were dead because of the organization Hoover created and led. And now celebrities were throwing a concert to advocate for his freedom. The December 9, 2021, Free Larry Hoover benefit concert at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum was a spectacle. Over 70,000 in attendance, millions streaming live on Amazon Prime. Kanye West and Drake, fresh from squashing their beef at Drake's Toronto home, shared the stage for nearly 3 hours, that dominated with a 26-song set of hits like Runaway, Can't Tell Me Nothing, and Jesus Walks, while Drake delivered crowd pleasers including Way Too Sexy and God's Plan. Interwoven were poignant moments, Hoover's pre-recorded voice booming through speakers, reflecting on regret and reform. Larry Jr., on stage, voice cracking as he described growing up without a father, pleading, "This is about breaking cycles, not glorifying the past." Proceeds went to criminal justice reform groups like the Ex-Cons for community and social change, amplifying messages of redemption. Kanye framed it as unity, two rivals reconciling for a greater cause, symbolizing how hip-hop could heal divides. Social media exploded. Hashtag Free Larry Hoover trending globally. Petitions surging, but backlash was swift and visceral. Victims' advocates protested outside the venue, holding signs like "No Freedom for Killers." In interviews, families shared raw pain. One mother whose son was gunned down in a 1990s GD turf war told CNN, "My boy's gone forever because of that gang's orders." Now stars throw parties for the man at the top. It's like our loss doesn't matter. Prosecutors echoed this, calling the event insensitive glorification, arguing it minimized Hoover's role in orchestrating violence that claimed hundreds of lives. Critics pointed to irony. The concert celebrated freedom while ignoring GD's ongoing toll. Chicago's 2021 murder rate hit 800 plus. Many gang-linked, online debates raged. Supporters cited Hoover's 50 years served as excessive, aligning with reform pushes like the First Step Act. Detractors saw celebrity hubris, Drake and the using Hoover's name for clout without addressing victims. The event spotlighted hip-hop's power and pitfalls in activism, uniting icons for change yet risking erasure of harm. Larry Jr. defended it as humanizing my father. But for many, it reopened wounds, questioning if redemption arcs should include those who built empires on blood. One victim's family member said in an interview, "My brother was murdered by the Gangster Disciples. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He never got a second chance. Why should Larry Hoover?" That's the fundamental tension in this debate. The arguments for Larry Hoover's release go something like this. Time served. Hoover has been in prison for over 50 years. He was 23 when he was first incarcerated. He's now in his 70s. He's served more time than many murderers serve. At what point is enough enough? Age and health. Hoover is elderly and has health issues. He's not a physical threat to anyone. What's the point of keeping an old man in Supermax? Rehabilitation. By all accounts, Hoover has been a model prisoner in recent decades. He's had very few disciplinary infractions. He's educated himself extensively. He's expressed remorse for the harm caused by the GD. Shouldn't the criminal justice system allow for the possibility of change? Excessive punishment. While Hoover's original sentence of 150 to 200 years was severe, the additional life sentences seem excessive, particularly when he was already serving what amounted to a life sentence. The punishment seems designed to make an example rather than serve justice. Compassionate release. The federal system allows for compassionate release in some cases, particularly for elderly, infirm inmates who pose no danger. Shouldn't Hoover be considered for this? Political prisoner argument. Some advocates go further, arguing that Hoover was targeted because he was attempting to organize black political power, that the prosecution was politically motivated, that he's effectively a political prisoner. Restorative justice. Advocates argue that Hoover could do more good on the outside, helping to steer young people away from gangs than he can locked in isolation. These are not unreasonable arguments, particularly the first few. American criminal justice has a problem with excessive sentences. We incarcerate more people than any country on earth. Sentences have gotten longer and longer, often without making us safer. But there are also strong arguments against Hoover's release. Severity of crimes. Hoover wasn't just a drug dealer. The organization he led was responsible for numerous murders. The original murder conviction involved the execution-style killing of William Pookie Young. The RICO case documented decades of violence. These weren't minor crimes, continued leadership. Federal prosecutors have consistently argued that Hoover never truly gave up control of the GD, that he continued to lead the organization even from prison, that his claims of reform were insincere, ongoing harm. The Gangster Disciples still exist. They're still involved in violence in Chicago and other cities. Young men are still joining, still killing and being killed. Releasing the founder might embolden the organization. Message sent. Releasing Hoover could send a message that even the worst gang leaders can eventually get out, potentially undermining efforts to combat gang violence. Victims' families. The families of people killed in GD-related violence strongly oppose Hoover's release. Their pain and their desire for justice matter, public safety. Even if Hoover is old and infirm, would he remain a figure of influence? If released, would young GD members see his release as a victory? As validation? Precedent. Hoover isn't the only gang leader serving life sentences. If he's released, what about all the others? Where do you draw the line? These are also not unreasonable arguments. The honest truth is that reasonable people can disagree on this question. There's no clear right answer, no obvious solution that balances all the competing interests and principles. The federal courts have consistently rejected Hoover's appeals and requests for sentence reduction. Judges have found that his sentence, while severe, was legally sound and that there's no basis for modifying it. The parole system has changed since Hoover was first sentenced. He was sentenced under old federal law. Under current law, there's no parole for federal crimes. He would need either a presidential commutation or a successful appeal on legal grounds. Neither seems likely. No president has been willing to commute Hoover's sentence. It would be politically toxic. The opposition would be fierce from law enforcement, from victims' families, from tough-on-crime politicians, from prosecutors who spent years putting him away. And there are no obvious legal grounds for appeal. His convictions have been upheld repeatedly. His sentences were within legal guidelines. There's no new evidence of innocence, so Larry Hoover remains in a DX Florence, and all indications are that he'll die there. The #FreeHoover movement, driven largely by his son and supported by some hip-hop artists and criminal justice reform advocates, continues. They organize petition drives, social media campaigns, public events, but it hasn't gained the mainstream traction needed to actually change his situation. Part of the problem is that Hoover isn't a sympathetic figure in the way that helps reform movements. He's not someone who was incarcerated for a minor drug offense. He's not someone who was wrongly convicted. He's not someone who was young and dumb and made a mistake. He was a crime boss who led an organization responsible for death and destruction. That's hard to get past, even for people who support criminal justice reform. The debate over Larry Hoover's case reflects larger debates in American society. How long is too long for a prison sentence? Can people truly change and be rehabilitated? How do we balance justice for victims with mercy for offenders? Does mass incarceration make us safer? Are there racial double standards in how we punish crime? What do we owe communities harmed both by crime and by our response to crime? These are questions without easy answers. What we can say is this: Larry Hoover's story, from Mississippi to Chicago to Supermax, is a distinctly American story. It's a story about poverty and racism, about the failure of systems, about choices and consequences, about power and powerlessness. And it's not over yet. Larry Hoover sits in his cell in Colorado, but the organization he built continues, transformed and fractured, but not destroyed. The Gangster Disciples today are not what they were in their 1980s and 1990s peak. The unified empire is gone. But the brand, the identity, the culture, those persist. Current law enforcement estimates put Gangster Disciples membership at around 30,000 to 35,000 across the country. Though precise numbers are impossible to determine, that's actually similar to estimates from the organization's peak, which might seem surprising given the decades of law enforcement pressure. But the nature of that membership has changed. In Chicago, the GD have fragmented into multiple sets that often operate independently. Some sets are still heavily involved in drug trafficking and violence. Others are more like neighborhood crews using the GD name and symbols, but not connected to any larger structure. The South Side and West Side of Chicago still have significant GD presence, but they're now competing with newer gangs and with breakaway factions. The unified territorial control they once had is gone. The violence continues. Chicago has struggled with gun violence for years. The city regularly records 500+ murders per year, sometimes many more. A significant portion of this violence is gang-related. And the GD are still major players. Young men in their teens and 20s are still joining the GD, still throwing up the six-pointed star, still getting into shootouts over territory and respect, still going to prison, still dying. The cycle that Larry Hoover helped create continues to churn. In other cities where the GD have chapters, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Memphis, and elsewhere, the story is similar. The name persists, but the connection to any central organization is tenuous or non-existent in some places. GD has become almost a cultural identifier, more than an actual organizational affiliation. Young people claim to be GD because their neighborhood is GD, because their older brother was GD, because the local set runs their block. They may not know the GD Constitution, may not have been formally initiated, may not even know who Larry Hoover is, the ideology that Hoover tried to create, the principles, the political aspirations. The community focus has largely faded. What remains is mostly the criminal enterprise and the violent reputation. This raises a philosophical question. Is Larry Hoover responsible for this ongoing violence? On one hand, he created the organization, he built its structure, he established its culture of violence and territorial control. Every young man who joins the GD today is, in some sense, inheriting something Hoover created. On the other hand, Hoover has been in prison, largely isolated for decades. He hasn't directed any of this recent activity. The GD today is as much a product of the hundreds of thousands of people who've been members over the years as it is of Hoover's original vision. Where does responsibility end? If you create something that outlasts you, that takes on a life of its own, that continues long after you've lost control of it, are you still responsible for what it becomes? These are questions that apply beyond just Larry Hoover. They're questions about legacy, about consequences, about how our choices ripple forward through time. The communities most affected by GD violence have complex views on all of this. Some community members see Hoover as the root of their problems. The GD brought drugs, violence, and death to their neighborhoods. Young men who could have had futures instead ended up dead or in prison because of the organization Hoover built. Others see the problem as bigger than one man or one gang. They see poverty, lack of opportunity, failing schools, racism, and abandonment by government as the root causes. In that view, Hoover was a product of these conditions, not their cause, and the GD, whatever harm they caused, also provided some structure and support in communities where there was nothing else. Many people hold both views simultaneously. It's not a contradiction, it's recognizing the complexity. The mothers who've lost sons to gang violence often have the most nuanced views. They know their sons made choices, but they also know the limited options their sons faced. They know the appeal of the gang, the money, the respect, the brotherhood. In neighborhoods where legitimate paths to those things are rare. They grieve their children, and they're angry at everyone. At the gangs, at the police, at the schools, at the politicians, at society, at the circumstances that created this situation. Their pain doesn't fit into neat policy debates, it just is. The educational system in Chicago has struggled to deal with gang influence. Teachers in schools with heavy gang presence describe feeling powerless. How do you teach when some students are more afraid of crossing gang boundaries than they are of failing? How do you maintain order when gang rivalries play out in the hallways? Some schools have tried gang intervention programs, bringing in former gang members to talk to students about the consequences of that life. These programs have mixed results. Some kids listen, many don't. The pull of the gang is strong, especially when the alternative is poverty and obscurity. The prison system in Illinois is still dominated by gang politics. The Gangster Disciples remain powerful in many facilities. Young men going to prison for the first time often feel pressure to affiliate for protection, and once you're in, getting out is nearly impossible. So prison, which is supposed to rehabilitate people and prepare them for release, instead often deepens gang involvement. This is one of the great failures of American criminal justice. We've created a system that makes people worse rather than better. The political aspirations that Larry Hoover once had for the GD have not materialized. There's no Gangster Disciples political party, no GD community organization running legitimate social programs. The vision of transforming from gang to political movement never happened. Could it have? Or was it always a fantasy, a way for Hoover to justify his criminal empire? We'll never know. The federal crackdown in the 1990s ensured that any such transformation, if it was ever truly possible, never had a chance to occur. What we do know is that the comparison Hoover sometimes made to political machines like Tammany Hall or the Chicago Democratic machine was never quite apt. Those organizations, corrupt as they were, had mechanisms for integrating into the legitimate system. They provided government services, even if those services came with strings attached. The GD was fundamentally a criminal enterprise. The violence and drug dealing were not side effects or temporary phases. They were core to what the organization was and what made it powerful. You can't transition from that to legitimacy easily, if at all. Some former Gangster Disciples have managed to leave the life and find legitimate success. There are men who were once high-ranking GD members who now work in community organizations, who mentor young people, who use their experience to steer others away from gangs. Their stories show that change is possible, that the choices you make as a young person don't have to define you forever. But these success stories are the exception, not the rule. Most men who rise high in the GD end up in prison for life or dead before they're 30. The question of accountability extends beyond Larry Hoover to all of us. As a society, what's our responsibility? We created the conditions: poverty, segregation, failing schools, economic isolation that made gangs attractive. We fought the war on drugs in a way that prioritized incarceration over treatment and destroyed communities. We built an education system that fails black and brown children at disproportionate rates. We created an economy where legitimate work pays poverty wages, while drug dealing can make you rich. Does that absolve individual criminals of responsibility? No, people make choices, and choices have consequences. But it complicates the picture. It reminds us that the story of gangs and crime isn't just about bad individuals making bad choices. It's about systems and structures, about opportunities and lack thereof, about cycles that repeat across generations. If we only blame individuals and only use punishment as our response, we'll never break those cycles. Chicago has tried various approaches to gang violence over the years. There have been massive police crackdowns. There have been gang intervention programs. There have been community investment initiatives. There have been job training programs. There have been violence interruption strategies. Some of these approaches have had modest success. Some have failed completely. The honest truth is that nobody has figured out how to truly solve the gang problem in Chicago or in any other American city. The problem is too complex, too deeply rooted, too tied up with larger social and economic issues. But we keep trying. Because the alternative, just accepting the violence as inevitable, is unacceptable. The legacy of Larry Hoover is not just the Gangster Disciples. It's also a question that American society still hasn't answered. How do we respond to people who commit serious crimes? Hoover has now been in prison for over 50 years. Half a century. He was 23 when he went in. He's now in his 70s. He's lost all his youth, all his adult life. He's been isolated in the Supermax for over 2 decades, experiencing conditions that some experts consider torture. Has justice been served? Some would say absolutely. Hoover was responsible, directly or indirectly, for numerous deaths. He built and led a criminal organization that destroyed lives and communities. He deserves severe punishment. Others would say that at some point, punishment becomes mere cruelty, that 50 years is enough for anyone, that the conditions at a DX are inhumane regardless of what someone did, that an elderly man poses no threat, and continuing to imprison him serves no purpose except revenge. Both views have merit. This is the discomfort at the heart of criminal justice. There are no perfect answers. Every approach has costs and trade-offs. Every decision leaves someone unsatisfied. We want justice for victims. We want to deter crime. We want to reform offenders. We want to protect the public, and sometimes these goals conflict with each other. The story of Larry Hoover forces us to confront these conflicts, as I've researched and told this story. I've been struck by how many people have strong opinions about Larry Hoover, despite knowing relatively little about him. He's become a symbol, a stand-in for larger debates, to some. He represents the failure of tough on-crime policies, a man whose decades of incarceration haven't made communities safer, haven't deterred others from joining gangs, haven't accomplished anything except human suffering. To others, he represents the danger of going soft on crime, a man whose influence persisted even from prison, who manipulated people with talk of community service while running a drug empire, who deserves exactly what he got. Both sides use Hoover to support their pre-existing beliefs about crime and punishment. But the real Larry Hoover is more complicated than either caricature. He was a brilliant organizer who built something unprecedented. He was a murderer and a crime boss. He caused immense harm. He also created programs that helped some people. He's been in prison longer than many murderers. He's also shown no clear evidence of true remorse or transformation. He's a human being, complex and contradictory, who made choices that had devastating consequences that continue to ripple outward decades later. And the question of what to do with him, what his story means, what we should learn from it, those questions remain unresolved. The Gangster Disciples will likely persist in some form for years to come. The name has power, the reputation has weight. As long as there are neighborhoods with poverty and violence, there will be young men looking for protection, belonging, and opportunity, and some of them will find it, or think they find it, in gangs. The challenge is to create alternatives that are equally compelling, to make legitimate paths to respect money, and brotherhood as accessible as the gang path. That's the work of generations. It requires investment in education, jobs, community infrastructure. It requires changing how we police and how we incarcerate. It requires a commitment to these communities that American society has rarely shown. Will we do it? History suggests pessimism, but history also shows that change is possible, that cycles can be broken, that different choices lead to different outcomes. The story of Larry Hoover is a tragedy for him, For his victims, for the communities affected, for the thousands of young men who followed in his footsteps into prison or early graves. But it doesn't have to be the only story. It doesn't have to be the story that keeps repeating. We can learn from it. We can do better. That's the choice we face. The story of Larry Hoover continues. While his federal sentences were commuted in May 2025, he remains imprisoned in Illinois on his state murder conviction, fighting for parole in a system that has denied him repeatedly. The empire he built has fragmented, but its echoes linger in the streets and in the debates over justice, redemption, and reform. He wakes up each morning in that small concrete cell. He eats his meals alone. He spends his 1 hour of recreation alone. He goes to sleep alone, day after day, year after year, in isolation that most of us cannot imagine. The empire he built has crumbled into fragments, but fragments that still cut, that still cause harm. The communities he came from still struggle with the same problems that created him: poverty, violence, limited opportunity. The criminal justice system still grapples with questions of punishment and redemption, of accountability and mercy. And somewhere in Chicago, a teenager is making a choice about whether to join a gang, facing the same pressures, the same limited options, the same terrible calculus that Larry Hoover once faced. The cycle continues until we break it. What do you think? Should Larry Hoover be released, or should he remain imprisoned for life? Is he a product of his environment who deserves a second chance, or a dangerous criminal who got what he deserved? Can someone who caused that much harm ever truly be redeemed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you made it this far in this journey, you're truly committed to understanding the full story. That deserves recognition. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the untold stories that shaped America. We've got more coming, stories that are complex, uncomfortable, important. Share this video with someone who loves true crime, hip-hop history, or American social history. Thanks for spending your time with me on this deep dive into one of the most controversial figures in American criminal history. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, every story has more than one side, and the truth is usually more complicated than we want it to be.